Right, let's see. Olag the Destroyer, done. Blurp the Insufferable, dead. Nebraska, united. Hillary, slain, yes, slain. Spigot got spiked. Right, and Newt with a K, dead. All right. Okay, that just leaves 4,632. Oh no, wait, the washerwoman was also involved in the murder case, yes? So 4,333 more villains to go before we're finished. Yay. Hello and welcome to this week's How to Be a Great GM. My name is Guy and I'm suffering from man flu. That's right, that's why there might be a slight change in the voice. There might be a wheezing, coughing cackle as I try and draw my last breath, which was never going to happen. Nonetheless, today we're talking about, is it possible to have more than one big bad end game Nemesis or not? And why should we have only one as opposed to having 50? Surely more is better. More than one gives us options, doesn't it? Well, yes and no. So we're going to unpack today that question of should you have one nemesis and multiple villains and little henchmen running around, or should you go more sandboxy and just have lots of potential villains all over the place and let the PCs decide who they want to allocate as their principal target? It's a tricky question, and one that boils down to personal taste as well as your particular playing style. So let's jump right into it. When we look at someone who wants something bad and is having difficulty getting it, in other words, the idea that we have a singular nemesis who has multiple villains working for them, but ultimately the campaign is centered around the PCs overcoming the big bad endgame, the BBEG, the big bad endgame. Ultimately, when the PCs have defeated the big bad end game, that's it, campaign over. We put away those particular books and we try a different system and potentially have a different GM. Who knows what happens, but ultimately it's all neatly wrapped up and done. We know when we've got to the end because, well, it says big bad end game. So it's easy for us. So when we look at it in terms of GM skill, this channel has always been about trying to help you improve your game, no matter how many years you've spent role-playing, whether it's a couple hours, whether you've never role-played before, or whether you are like myself, someone who was born with the red box in hand and was ready to play the moment they came out the womb. Nonetheless, with that visual out of the way, this is what happens when I'm on drugs, you see. When we look at this kind of idea of the singular villain, the singular nemesis, I should say, with multiple villains, what it does is it allows you to focus on the story. As the game master, as the dungeon master, if you know that you have this big Darth Vader or Emperor Palpatine at the end, the Terminator is your big monster that the PCs will encounter and eventually defeat, it allows you to fairly easily plot out a course of your campaign. You can identify 15 or so key adventures, at least that's according to me anyway. If you go and watch some of the other videos, you can clearly see where they need to go. You can bring your party back on track when they've wandered off too far from the main point, as well as basically know where you need to be as the storyteller. When you don't have that necessarily, when you just have this large world filled with all kinds of interesting characters that the PCs can encounter, you don't necessarily have that guiding track, if you like, those training wheels to give you a sense of, well, this is where it really should end, or do you just continue it in perpetuity? So it gives you a focus. What it also allows you to do is by having a single nemesis, by having that big overall story, you can have many little fires. You can have many little adventures that the players need to send their characters on to unpack this big adventure. So you have the advantages of the sandbox, whereby you can have villains that are horrific, you can have villains that are mysterious, you can have villains that are romantically involved. So you can run through all of the different types of flavors of villains that you would normally encounter in a more sandboxy approach, but you are always still focused, you're still brought back on track to the idea that the Nemesis is guiding and manipulating it all from behind the scenes somehow. It gives you one source to turn for. So when the players start making weird and wonderful connections, as long as you can link it back to the source, that's okay. It means that it can become part of the narrative and you can move forward. It means your players also only really have one way to look, and that helps focus them as well. They will, of course, look in all different directions anyway. That's the beauty of players, but it allows you to remember to look back to a single source. Unlike more sandboxy ones where you have more is more is more. You have many villains. You've got a villain here, a villain there, and there is no overriding nemesis. There's no overriding major plot point. Or plot story, I should say. It just is wherever the PCs happen to go. They wander into this nemesis, or into this villain's story, I should say. So they wander into this villain's realm. They're now part of that villain's story for as long as they remain there. If they defeat the villain, that's fantastic, and they will get some local rewards, but they can then wander into another realm or another territory and come across another villain. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. And having multiple nemesis, which is another question that gets asked fairly frequently, gives you the same problem. Your PCs can become overwhelmed. Not necessarily the PCs, the players. Who do we have to kill because of what? Why were they doing that? Because of this? Is there a link? They might try and find links where there actually aren't any. Or, and this is the worst case, they go, oh, it's just so much, I don't know where to even start. Which villain? So, there is a risk that you run when you have multiple nemesis or multiple villains that just don't seem to have a single thread and that don't necessarily move forward because they're all waiting for the PCs to trigger them, if you like. If they don't, if they are triggered automatically anyway, and they're doing their own thing and the world continues, and it's up to the PCs to try and inveigle their way into these stories and to make their impression upon these villains and things, it can start to feel endless. And although the characters might enjoy, or the players, I should say, might enjoy leveling up their characters, after a while it's like, wow, we've been pottering around and we've pretty much killed or slain everything that this world has to give us. What's next? So sometimes your conclusion then starts to feel more like a retirement with a little bit less bang and a little bit more, thank goodness it's over. That's not to say that you can't have multiple nemesis or anything on the like. We need to just be very careful how we present them. And the way that I would do that is by ensuring that you don't overwhelm. If the players move out of a zone into another zone, they flee the villain that they are engaged with because they don't like the villain, they feel they can do something else, whatever the case might be, don't trigger the next villain until they've dealt with the last one. So perhaps the last villain goes, well, they're now out of my realm, I am now free to act as I so choose. Let their story continue, let the PCs decide to come back and engage with that villain or nemesis, whatever you want to title them. Let them come back, engage, and finish that story off first before launching the next one. Who says that Baron von Richtenstein needs to wait for Lady Cassandra to finish her plots and things before he can launch his? Well, you do. Who says that he doesn't launch his before she launches hers? Well, you do. So instead of throwing everything in the air and saying, well, they all launch at the same time because why would any of them delay based on not knowing each other? Absolutely correct. But you don't want them to get forgotten. If you've invested a lot of time in creating these plots and schemes, it's about trying to make sure that your players can access them, can feel as if the world is populated with these evil maniacs all trying to take over the universe at once, but that they don't get overwhelmed and they don't forget who they are fighting, and that there's a definite conclusion to each one that they encounter. If you look at, say, things like DC Universe stories where you've got the Flash or the Titans or whatever, the Flash is probably more appropriate, but it doesn't really matter, any of them. they're very episodic. The villain arrives, they do something bad, then they move on. There might be this overarching story loitering around in the background, but generally each week is a bad guy that gets stopped. If all of those villains were triggered at exactly the same time, the Flash would be very hard-pressed to try and stop them all. Someone would get through. There's just not enough time to cope with everything. But we release them one at a time, it keeps it going, and of course the overall story arc is supposed to keep us from not feeling as if it's just an endless tide, but then it might eventually get to a point where it comes to a conclusion. So this is where we then talk about the micro versus the macro. In this particular case, micro means smaller. We want smaller adventures, smaller paths with multiple villains or with multiple nemesis. So instead of having a 15 adventure process, as I've prescribed before, on a longer single nemesis type of campaign, you would want to have a campaign that runs for maybe 4 or 5 or 6 adventures per nemesis or per henchman, so that each henchman or each villain or nemesis, whatever you want to call them, each of those bad guys gets their opportunity to shine. There are a couple adventures involved in defeating those particular bad guys, but then they're defeated and then we can move on. So that's almost like a one-shot in a way, except that you're not restricted to just running one-shots. You can run these things longer and longer. Now again, this is also not to say that if you've chosen a single nemesis, a single big bad end game, you can't do all of this stuff. You absolutely can. And that's why when people say to me, "Oh, I don't like the idea of a single overarching story. Can I just have little one-off nemesis running around with their plots and things?" Yes, absolutely you can. By turning it into an overall campaign, you're just bringing it to the point where you can have a bigger conclusion where you wrap up all the threads together. Here, what we're talking about is a faster conclusion so that the threads are each terminated before the characters move on to their next case. What is beneficial about this type of approach, the smaller campaign, the shorter idea of well, you've fought off the Duke here, you're done defeating the Duke, is that you get these wonderful moments of punctuation, which is the downtime that the party might not necessarily have in a big bad end game where you've only got one nemesis, and it's almost as if the ball starts rolling and it's like a feature film where there's very little time for downtime. So by having a restricted number of villains, or at least by restricting your number of adventures per each villain, you start to get these wonderful moments of punctuation, and that gives you the opportunity for character growth, for character stories to suddenly emerge, and not to feel as if they're just little side jaunts off of the main quest, but to feel as if they are the main quest themselves. And that to me is the biggest strength of running a game where you've got multiple nemesis or where you've just got lots of villains and no single story. When you do a character story, it feels as if it is the main focus because it is that particular moment in that campaign. It's not overshadowed by other things. So again, that allows the characters, that allows the players to focus just on that without having the fear of this bigger story being involved. They're not looking for links. They're not looking for ways that this somehow is going to be used against us later on. It's a closed chapter. Move on, start afresh almost, if you like, but with the history of the party having worked together. So there are big benefits to running lots of different disparate adventures that have no major overarching story. There is no singular nemesis. It is simply a nemesis for each of these moments, if you like, or just a villain. It doesn't really matter on the nomenclature. You can choose to call your big bad whatever you want to call them. There is a definite advantage to that. There is, of course, a definite disadvantage insofar as if your players don't conclude things, if they don't wrap things up, they will feel overwhelmed and as if they don't know what to do. So bear that in mind the next time you are plotting out your major campaign, whether it is deciding to do a longer campaign that's going to run out over the course of a year with a singular narrative, or whether it's a case of, actually, I've got this amazing world and I want to see where the characters go. It's entirely up to you. And what's nice about things is that if you start this way, if you start with, there's no big bad, there's no real big bad, you can discover a big bad over the course of the first couple of adventures and go, well, actually, there could have been someone organizing all of this from the shadows. I think I'm going to introduce it. So you start to discover something about your story that you didn't even know existed. And it's only because your players have been going through it, it's only because you've been going through it that you actually find an emergent nemesis or big bad end game. So that's entirely possible. And that doesn't often happen if you're doing it the other way around, where you have a planned big bad end game. You're not likely to find someone higher up than they are. So there are many advantages to both solutions. Just be aware of the disadvantage that comes with the one where you've got no end goal. Because without an end goal, well, that's exactly where you're going to get to. Nowhere. Anyway, until next time, I wish you and yours the very healthiest of gaming. Pondney, check. Applecrumb the Thrifter, dead. Womblesnot, on the run. On the run, dead. Like button, smacked. Subscribe button, clicked. Goblin Bell, rung. I should hope so that we can track what happens next week. Yes. Yes. Thick lip, dead.